What are the main threats to our national security and therefore also to our freedom and prosperity? How well equipped are we to meet those threats? And what reforms are necessary to remedy the gaps in our preparation? In this video, you will hear from two defense experts, Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution and Nadia Schadlow of the Hudson Institute, as they provide alternative complementary perspectives on the threats facing America's armed forces in the 21st century. While Michael takes a big-picture view of strategic competitors like China and Russia, as well as nuclear powers like North Korea and perhaps soon Iran, Nadia drills down on the cooperative relationships among these adversaries that present operational challenges to our security. You will see on many issues there is considerable overlap, but also different emphases and occasional disagreement.
The 1992 National Military Strategy explained that there were no significant threats facing the United States. One of its phrases is worth quoting. It said, "We can still point to a North Korea, a weakened Iraq, and perhaps even a hostile Iran, and that while there may be one or two added to such a list without straining credulity, the real threat was the threat of the unknown." That's not the case today.
Today's U.S. national security strategy and U.S. defense strategy under President Biden, but really very similar to President Trump's, prioritize China and Russia. China as what's called the number one threat or the pacing challenge because of its capability to keep innovating and improving, and Russia the acute threat, largely because of its invasion of Ukraine. But I think it's also useful to remember a framework that was introduced about 10 years ago, around 2015, by Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Joseph Dunford. And they talked about a 4+1 threat matrix, where in addition to Russia and China, there was prominence given to the acute threats of North Korea and Iran. And then also the ongoing broader war against extremism or terrorist organizations were given a sort of an additional separate status, the +1, because they weren't so precisely definable in terms of a government or a geography. So 4+1 is still useful because it gets you thinking more broadly. One thing that has been said about our military by former Secretary of Defense Gates, and it's a good thing to remember, we have a very good record at predicting the next war. We almost always get it wrong. So if you get too specific in thinking about who your next adversary is or where the threat is, you may do a disservice.
The main threats to the American military come from the so-called Big Three, Russia, Iran, and China. But North Korea and the jihadists pose additional challenges. China, as we all agree, is a so-called pacing threat. It has the capabilities that can challenge the United States across the full spectrum of our force. Russia remains a serious nuclear power that is now using conventional means to reshape the landscape of Europe. Iran is providing Russia with thousands of drones and helping it build drone plants. China continues to provide Russia with the equipment it needs, like semiconductors, and North Korea is providing millions of rounds of ammunition to Moscow. So it's not just these separate threats, but how they come together to present operational problems for the U.S. military. This is quite a difference from 30 years ago. China is the most consequential strategic competitor we're facing. I think we all agree that China is a pacing challenge, meaning it can compete with us really across the full spectrum of military competition, technological, economic, because we're so interdependent, and even I'd say diplomatic, because in many ways China represents an ideological threat. It's a systemic rival, as the EU pointed out, actually, others as well, but it's a systemic rival because it presents a different system as an alternative to our system.
China is a fascinating and complex challenge for the United States. We would be badly mistaken to consider it already an adversary as a foregone conclusion, not only because that would create hostility in our relationship, but it could become a self-perpetuating or self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that to the extent each side sees the worst in each other, In the event of a crisis, each side could be convinced the conflict has become inevitable anyway, so maybe this is the moment to seize the opportunity to strike first. That kind of thing has been seen historically. Maybe not so much in the nuclear age, but historically that's often been the way that great nation states have viewed each other. For example, in the prelude to World War I. And ultimately then people make decisions that presuppose almost an inevitability of war, when in fact that makes things far worse. So I am concerned that in the United States today, we not overdo the presumption of China as a future adversary. It's a fascinating question and strategically very important whether we should be sizing our forces to be able to fight one war at a time or two. We did have something approaching a two-war capability for the first couple decades after the Cold War ended, through the 1990s and 2000s. But in those days, our adversaries were Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and even then we obviously struggled when we were trying to deal with both Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time through the first decade of the 2000s.
We're in the middle right now, essentially, of two simultaneous conflicts, one in Europe and one in the Middle East. We likely should be preparing for more. We need to be worried about three regional balances of power: Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This doesn't mean that we have to do everything alone, nor should we, nor can we. We need to rely on and work with allies and partners in all of those regions of the world. But what happens in these regions of the world matter. Global power is ultimately determined from what happens in these three key regions of the world. Deterrence failed in Ukraine, deterrence failed in the Middle East. How does the United States work with partners to rebuild deterrence? What is the formula for doing that?
We say we want the capability to defeat China or Russia while deterring North Korea, while deterring Iran, while protecting the homeland, and maintaining momentum in the fight against violent extremism, namely terrorism. It's really only one all-out war. And we assume that the other large peer threat, China or Russia, whichever one we're not fighting, will not join the fight and will not simultaneously see an opportunity to create its own problem halfway around the world from where we're engaged with the preponderance of our military forces.
The bottom line is our military can't dominate as it could in the post-Cold War period, when we had relative dominance across four domains: land, air, space, and sea. For well over 15 years now, we have lost that dominance.
The American military services, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, now the Space Force, tend to have a proclivity towards high-tech weaponry and big weapons platforms. It's not always true, and it's more true of the Air Force and the Navy than of the Army and Marine Corps, but nonetheless, that's been the tendency. And so as defense budgets have gone down in the last generation since the Cold War ended, people have prioritized fighter jets, bombers, big ships, etc., more than munitions, ordnance to be fired from these various weapons platforms, spare parts, repair facilities, multiple redundant airfields so that some could survive in the event of conflict.
And this is compounded by the relative lack of concern about defense matters by many of our allies. Many were uncomfortable when Donald Trump emphasized this, but it's a big problem. As the leading U.S. military ally and Europe's biggest defense spender, Britain still only has around 150 deployable tanks and perhaps a dozen serviceable long-range artillery pieces. Last year, it was reported that the British military considered sourcing multiple rocket launchers from museums to upgrade and donate to Ukraine. France has fewer than 90 heavy artillery pieces, equivalent to what Russia loses roughly every month on the Ukrainian battlefield. And Germany's army has enough ammunition for 2 days of battle and less than 100 battle-ready tanks. Compare this to the 1990s, when it had around 4,000. So in the post-Cold War period, the Europeans basically disarmed. It is perhaps trite to observe how much has changed since America's relatively unmatched power during the post-Cold War period, and in particular the loss of our relative power since that time. Yet reaffirming the scope of how the world has changed and its impact on American power remains important, if only to highlight how much of our defense infrastructure and the processes that undergird that infrastructure have not actually changed. Indeed, much of it remains stubbornly archaic, and this is crippling our ability to respond to new threats. Policymakers need to consider the implications of the limited flexibility in the defense budget. We need multi-year funding, stockpiling, and the ability to supply most of what we need from ourselves and our allies. There's also the need to act faster. We're facing, as some analysts have called it, a time-based competition. Time matters. Taiwan is now waiting years for the weapons we've promised them to improve and increase their deterrent posture. Scale is also a problem across the force. There are great companies that innovate. We have great new technologies, but we need to spread them throughout the force quickly. And we need more creative operational concepts, more of them, and a better way of linking new technologies to these efforts.
Some people say, how can we want to spend even more than the $850 billion a year we're spending on national defense when there's so much waste at the Pentagon? And yes, there is waste at the Pentagon, but the way I think about it is it's waste or fat that's marbled into the muscle. In other words, it's not easily identifiable and easily extractable. There are great cliches and adages over the years about how you shouldn't assume your war plans are going to succeed the way you want. Clausewitz talked about how in war everything looks easy, but even the easy things are hard, and there's a great fog of war associated with once you get into a fight, things don't play out the way you thought, and you don't see the battlefield the way you hoped. And then maybe to keep it simple, but get to the point, Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan going into a fight until they get hit in the nose. So we need to be planning for a protracted struggle. Keep those high-quality, smallish forces and those war plans that envision a rapid victory, but also be planning for the distinct possibility of something much messier and more protracted.
Defense budgets and federal budgets are on the surface quite boring. No one really wants to dive into them. I certainly don't. But what's important about them, and specifically the defense budget, is that it determines the size of our defense establishment, and it determines how money is spent within that establishment, meaning it makes it effective or not. And we need an effective defense establishment because that underpins, ultimately, American freedom and liberty. We can talk about soft power, and it's important. We can talk about our economic strength, and of course that's very, very important. But all of those things are linked fundamentally to the capability to defend our interests, and that comes down to our defense establishment and our defense budget.
The U.S. defense budget, national defense budget, is big, and we're all paying for it. And some people think it should be bigger, some people think it should be smaller, but it's a lot, no matter how you slice it. It's going to approach $1 trillion very soon. That's $1 trillion out of a U.S. economy that's around 30 trillion. We may have to have an answer to the question of, should we keep this size defense budget? And for those who want to increase it, they're going to have a hard task explaining and convincing people, do I do it out of higher taxes, smaller entitlements, a smaller federal role in science, technology, investment, infrastructure, or an even bigger deficit? These are going to be big questions for the country as a whole. I'm not saying hawks have all the answers. I'm not saying a robust American engagement is always the correct conclusion or path forward. But I do think the broadest lesson of the post-World War II world is things stay more stable when we're engaged. None of us want a world in which the great powers in particular are fighting each other. That could put all of our survival at peril, in addition to the well-being and future of our planet.
The Tennenbaum Program for Fact-Based Policy is an important new Hoover Institution initiative intended to improve the quality of information shaping the nation's most debated policy questions. It is dedicated to collecting and analyzing data and providing a forum for experts on both sides of the political aisle from alternative policy perspectives to educate the American public about important and often controversial topics.